You're listening to Feathers, a podcast of stories about God speaking and His people having just enough faith to believe Him and obey. I hope these stories inspire you and encourage you to take flight in your own faith. I'm your host, Amy Bennett, and this is episode 0. Well, hey friends, and welcome to Feathers. I am so excited to get this podcast started with you. Today's podcast is going to be a little bit different than the normal podcast. You can think about this as an about page of a website, so you get to know me a little bit more and hopefully understand what this whole podcast is going to be about. So let's start by introducing myself a little bit more. I am Amy Bennett, as the intro said. I'm 36 years old. I have been married to my husband, Scott, for 16 years now, going on 17. We actually met when I was a sophomore in high school and then got married in between my sophomore and junior year in college. We have 3 kids. We have Emma, who is 12, Lexi, that is 10, and we've just adopted our 9-year-old son, Jacob, from foster care in August of 2014. And you're going to be hearing a little bit more about that later on in the podcast. So I have my degree in computer science. I'm actually a developer for a large bank in Charlotte. And my husband is a highway patrolman for the state of South Carolina. We live just outside Charlotte in the suburbs in Fort Mill, South Carolina. We love it here in the South. As you can't tell by my accent, yes, we are in the South. So in my spare time, I like to blog. I've actually been blogging since 2002, and that's kind of looked different throughout the years. But of course, it started like a lot of people's where I was just journaling online. I don't think I even told too many people about it in real life until probably 2008. And then since then, it's kind of grown since then to what I like to see it as a ministry. And I write a lot about faith and family, a couple other little things, but that's my hobby. You can find me over at amyjbennett.com. So let's go ahead and talk about what this podcast is about. So if I could boil this podcast down to one word, it would simply be faith. And it's all about increasing our faith. I think it's so important to God that our faith is not stagnant. Faith is not something, it's just a list of beliefs that we adhere to. Faith is active and alive and well and growing and changing, and God is always challenging us and putting things in our lives in order to grow that. And so that's what this podcast is about, is those stories where God has either asked them to do something crazy or scary or something that was not according to conventional wisdom. And what does it look like when people say yes to that? How is their faith increased? Or it could be a situation where God places something in their life like disease or job loss or a death. And God asks the questions, will you trust me through this? Will your faith increase through this? And no matter what it is, we're going to be able to see how when people say yes to God, yes, I believe you, how He increases our faith. And so in my life, a lot of times how God works is He asks me to do things that are really scary. And I have struggled with fear my whole life. And I think it's, very common for people to do that, all through the Bible. Angels are telling man, do not be afraid. So I know I am not in company by myself, but He asked me to jump off cliffs a lot and to do scary things. And also He is asking me to increase my faith by not believing in coincidence, but believing that a God that we cannot see is at work in our lives. And so a lot of times I will see things in my life that a lot of people would attribute to coincidence, but I know that God is at work. And so my story, what I like to call my feather story, is my faith story. And it's about a call in our lives to adopt. It's about seeing God at work in my writing, at my blog. It's about simply listening to Him in everyday life and then seeing Him at work. And at the end of the day, what's really awesome is to see that not just my faith is increased, but the people around me. And even through this podcast, He's continuing growing my faith and growing the faith of those around me. And I hope it does that today. And I hope this whole podcast does that when we hear stories of other people's faith in action, that our own faith grows and that we can find Him faithful in our lives too. So let's go ahead and jump into my feather story. It starts in October 2012 when I went to the Illume blogging conference. It's a Christian women's blogging conference. And at that conference, I sat in a session with Holly Girth and Stephanie Bryant, and they were teaching about building your personal brand. And that simply just means building that promise that you give to your readers of what they can expect. So after I came out of that conference, I came home a couple months later and decided to rebrand my website from Permission to Peruse to amyjbennett.com. And as part of that, I actually hired Holly Girth to come and help me with that vision and what that should look like. And part of what she has us do is create a Pinterest board, actually 5 of them, and then pin pictures to it and just randomly pick things that you feel fit you and your blog. And when that report came back, she said that she had found a theme of wings and feathers. And that was a sign of desiring to encourage people and to lift others up. And that totally resonated with me because that is exactly what I hope to accomplish by writing. So that was the first time that I had seen feathers kind of show up in our story. And to me, it was just kind of like a seed was planted that I wanted to encourage people and inspire people through my writing. The next couple months, I thought that creating my personal brand was really going to help me and be able to go forward and really grow my blog. And, I was trying to do all the things that the pro bloggers try to tell you to do, pretty pictures and questions at the end of your post and, all of these things. But I found myself really frustrated because I found myself really relying on what other people thought about the blog. Unless somebody told me that they were encouraged or, I felt like people must have liked it because they shared it a lot. Unless that was happening, I just felt like a total failure. And I was really ended up trying to make my writing go around what I thought people wanted. And in some ways that's good, but for me, it was not. So it was going into fall of 2013, and I had already bought a ticket to Illume again for the next fall. And at that point, I was so frustrated and dry and almost depressed. And I really was about ready to walk away from blogging. Actually, I had been blogging for, I think, 11 years at this point, and I had just kind of gotten to the point where maybe it was just time for me to walk away. So as I came up to Illume, I really felt the Lord prompting me just to take some time to spend time with Him. So that looked like journaling a lot, praying, worshiping with music, and listening to a lot of sermons on podcasts and just really seeking the Lord. And one day He gave me this picture of what blogging should look like for me. And that is simply that I needed to live a good life, have a rich relationship with Him. And out of the outflow of that, then I should write as a gift back to the Lord. And that was part of my art. And whatever happened after that was not up to me. The rest was up to the Lord. And if He wanted to encourage people through the words that I wrote, then that was really up to Him. And I didn't have to worry about that. He was going to take care of that. So I actually had drawn it on a piece of paper and stuck it in my suitcase when I went to Illume. And I still had my hands open to say, Lord, if this is yours, if you want me to continue in this, then please use this weekend to show me that that's true. So, all of the speakers, really just confirmed what I was thinking and what I was feeling the Lord lay on my heart. So the last night they had some worship time at the very end. They also had, while there was music playing, the David Walker Band was playing, and while they were playing, they actually had gotten 10 artists to come and paint paintings, and they were going to give them away randomly to the bloggers at the conference. Their hope was that the art really meant something to the bloggers and would encourage them. The worship began, and I think I spent the whole entire hour just crying. I really just felt the Lord's presence. And, after such a fulfilling weekend, I was just really overwhelmed. And I actually had a lady that I didn't know. She didn't know me, and she came to pray for me. And she actually said the words, that the Lord could see that I was empty and dry, and yet that He was hovering over me, and that my attempts, even though they may have been self-serving, I'm not sure, but they were like a gift poured out to Him. And what I needed to do was to be like Samuel when Eli told him just to go to the Lord and say, "Here I am." And my job was just to be available. And so at the end of the worship, if I wasn't already fulfilled, I won one of the 10 paintings. They had them available right away. And so I walked up on the left side of the stage there, and I just busted out crying when I saw the painting again. It was so overwhelming. All it was a square canvas, and it's painted blue in the background, and then in the middle of it is just one single huge feather. I couldn't believe it. And even more than that, underneath it, she had written the word replenish. And so in this one picture, it was confirming everything that I had been searching for. Holly with the feather and wanting to encourage people and lift others up. It was replenish, and it was what the Lord was saying is that He was going to replenish me, and that this blogging was going to be the outflow of Him pouring into me. And so I left that weekend, just more sure of my call to write than ever. And that really was, to me, a turning point. That since then, I would say that I have really written for the Lord and have really given up just the huge desire to have people's approval. And the wonderful thing is that it's grown since then. Here we are on a podcast. Like, who knew that was going to happen? So there's a lot that's been happening since then, though. And that's where our adoption comes in. So in 2014, we had been waiting several years at this point to adopt from our social services here in South Carolina. Well, in July, we got the call that we had been matched with a little boy. He was 8 years old, and we were ecstatic. So we began all of our visits, and we had to start with half-day visits and then move all the way up to full weekend visits, but it all went really quickly. One of the very first visits that he came to our house, he found a feather in our yard. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. I just set it in a basket, and he asked me to keep it till next time, which I did. And then there was another visit later on. I believe it was one of the full weekend visits, and he found 2 more feathers. And at this point, I was kind of like, what's going on here? Because we have lived in our house for 10 years, and we only have 2 trees in our house, and we've never found a feather. The kids haven't. We haven't. It's just not like a thing. We live in like I mentioned, we lived in the suburbs of Charlotte, and there's a ton of trees here, but don't get me wrong. But just where we are, it's just, not a bunch of forest around us. Anyway, so at that point, it kind of just piqued my interest, and it reminded me of what God had done with the feathers between, the session with Holly and the painting in a loom. And I was like, oh man, God, are you doing something here? Are you, I'm not sure. So I kind of just tucked that away. And then our son came to live with us at the beginning of August. And when I was putting his things away, there was a whole baggie of feathers. He had been collecting feathers the whole year that he had been in foster care. And so this feather thing wasn't just, me and my writing beforehand. It was also him on his own in foster care collecting them. And then he had come to our house and found feathers. So I really felt like at that time, like, wow, like I really think that this, it was just a God thing, that He was just saying, this is your son. And, this is just a sign that you're on the right path. Well, one day I was going to write about it. I had been blogging through our whole adoption process publicly, sharing what I could at the time, and everybody was just so supportive of us during that time. And the next few weeks turned out to be really hard. As you can imagine, adopting is, and it was not anybody's fault. It was just a high stress time. And guys, my hair was falling out. My gums were inflamed. I had rashes on my feet. Like, that just sounds nasty. I'm sorry. But I just want to say that it was just very stressful. And a lot of it was just some of my past was kind of just bubbling up just because of the stress. And, some of that was the kids just trying to figure each other out and fighting a lot. And, confrontation is really, really hard for me. So that just makes it a high stress environment for me anyway. And so it was just a difficult time, but I was this whole time, trying to see God in all of these moments. And there were so many moments, leading up to that where I really did see that God was working. I mean, just in certain dates that had happened, and just small moments where I really did see God working. And so I wanted to blog about these feathers. And it was one morning I was thinking about writing it, and the Lord really prompted me to, instead of doing some exercises inside with a DVD, that I would take my dog on a walk. And I don't do this routinely, like on a daily basis. I do walk my dog, but just not on a daily basis. But I was like, okay, well, I can walk Bella today. So I went on the walk, and as I was contemplating this, I just got real bold, and I said, Lord, will you please give me a feather just to confirm that this tie that I'm seeing is what I'm thinking, and that you're in this, and that even though this is really hard and this doesn't feel like it's good because it's hard, that it is okay, and you are in this. And so I got halfway through my walk. I started to turn back. I was more than halfway through my walk. I got down to the stop sign that goes to my street. And normally I would turn left there at a stop sign to go home. And I felt the Lord prompt me to turn right. And I was, not sure about that. But, I hadn't found my feather. And I was like, okay, well, maybe my feather's down there. And sure enough, I turn to my right, take probably 10 steps. And y'all, there on the curb was my feather. And I went, Lord, you did it. You did it. And I just, I really couldn't believe it. How many times have you prayed for something and then minutes later it physically materializes before your eyes? That was insane. It's not like that it materialized, but he let my eyes see that. And he knew that feather was there, and he led me directly to it. And that is just a miracle to me. And in that moment, I just knew that God was with us, and no matter what, that we were on the right path and we were going to be able to make it through. And so I turned to go back. I could not wait to start blogging about this and to write and share what I had been seeing with all the feathers up till then. And when I got to my house, I just really felt the Lord prompting me to go beyond the house. So I was like, are you sure? And, there's some doubt there. I'm not going to lie. There was some doubt, but I had a feather in my hand. So I was like, okay, we're going to go. And it wasn't 2 houses down that we got. And right in the middle of the road, there was another feather. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, oh my gosh, you just gave me 2 feathers. And it really was like the Lord said, hey, if you really thought that the last feather was an accident, let me just give you another feather just to make sure you know that that's me that's leading you to these things. And that was awesome. He had given me double. And then I was just about to race back to the house to write about this. And I felt the Lord saying, go to the end of the cul-de-sac. So that's what I did. And sure enough, I got to the end of our cul-de-sac, and there on the curb again was another feather. And, I was just totally blown away by this. It was straight up miracle to me. 3 feathers, all in one walk, all in one morning. And to me, those 3 feathers represented my 3 kids. It was like I'm the mama hen and my little 3 chicks and their feathers. And to me, it was just another confirmation that just God was in it, that even though this adoption was hard, He had called us to it, and this little boy was the right one. And so I went back and I wrote about it, and it was so well received. And I loved that, and encouraged people, inspired people, and that was exactly, what I wanted. And I thought that was going to be kind of the end of our feather story, that, God had used this feather for my blogging and for the adoption, and then, that was going to be it. But as it turns out, that was sort of just the beginning. Or I guess that was kind of, to me, a turning point in the feather story where it got really interesting. What happened was that I think every day for about 3 weeks, people were finding feathers. And it was really cool stories. It wasn't just that people were rushing out to the woods to find feathers. It was that feathers were showing up in people's paths. And a lot of times it was in weird places. Like, I think one of the first one was somebody just walked out their front door and it was just right on their front stoop. My sister-in-law found it inside her office building. Let's see. I found it in my office building 5 floors up with no windows and no doors besides the elevators. And let's see. One of my favorite stories was a lady whose mother was dying. She read the story and did not pray for a feather because she didn't want to be disappointed if she didn't get one. But then she was coming out of the hospital and there was one right by her car. And then every day and every time she went from the hospital and then back to her car, she found one in each place. That whole week till she passed away, I believe it was a Saturday she passed away, she had gotten a feather. And she told her 24-year-old son about it, who kind of looked at her like she was, cuckoo. And then he left to go get something to eat, I believe, and then he came back and was holding a feather. There had been a feather that floated down right in front of his face, and he was able to grab it out of the air, and he was like, whoa. The same thing happened to her daughter, that she told her about it and was like, what? And she went home and she found a feather, I believe, in her house. So when they had the funeral with her mother, she had asked a friend to go to a store to buy some candles for the funeral. And her friend found a feather in a puddle at the store. It was a white feather. They actually framed that picture of that feather for me, and I have it sitting in my living room. I have friends, I think I had 2 friends who had car trouble and ended up finding, I think one found a feather like on their car, and then one found them inside their car. My mom found one right outside on her driveway, right by her door, like right where she gets in, and it was her birthday in September, and that was a lot of fun to see. Gosh, there's so many. I quit counting at, I think, 75. So there's so many stories. One friend, I think, had one. She had cancer, and she was having a medical test, and she saw a feather that morning. She was leaving, and then she discounted it, and she was like, nah, that's just a fluke. And it turns out later that day, she found another feather, and she was like, okay. So it was just amazing. When God gave me those feathers that day, He gave me the verse, Psalm 91:4. He will cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you will find comfort. I just believe that God used that moment when I found those 3 feathers and just totally multiplied it across the people who had read the story, and used that to remind them of that same verse, and then in turn reminded them that God was with them and God was going to comfort them through all of these difficult times. I mean, y'all, death and cancer, all of these are like serious issues. And just to see God work through those because of that story was just amazing to me. And as our adoption transition got a little bit easier into October and November, our feathers kind of went away, and our troubles with our adoption transition kind of went away. And to me, as I look back at that time, that really was a time that I was growing so much in my faith. I just look back now and I think about how faithful God was to us to bring Jacob into our family, and just to see that come to fruition. That just grew my faith so much. And then just to watch him, just walk side by side and step by step with us through that transition process. I just believed so much more how real God is and how close He is and how faithful He is to walk with us through these both joyous and difficult times, because isn't it usually mixed joy and difficulty? So as I look back now, to me, the feather was just a symbol of that season of my life. And for me, it was such a faith growing time, and that's represented by the feather. So that's kind of where the name Feathers comes from. So each week we'll be talking to a guest and interviewing them, and just basically hearing their story about how their faith was increased, whether it was something big and difficult, scary, crazy that God called them to do, or it was a difficult season in their life that God asked them to walk through and remain faithful to Him. So guys, I am so excited to start this Feathers podcast with you. I think it has so much possibility and power to see how God is going to move through it. So I cannot wait to be with you on episode 1 next week. And in the meantime, you guys can find all the show notes from this episode over at featherspodcast.com or over on my site, amyjbennett.com/featherspodcast. Hope you guys check it out, and we will see you back next week.